Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlickers, shills, teslators, peasants, vassals. I'm a useful idiot. Today I want to talk about Iran and the negotiations, these unprecedented negotiations going on between Iran and the United States, thawing out relations that have been frosty for the better part of 30 some odd years. And there's a lot of debate about what's going on here. So let's sort through all the noise out there, all the propaganda, and see if we can get to the reality of the situation here. So first of all, the supposed good things about these negotiations. It temporarily freezes Iran's nuclear program. Iran must convert or dilute its fuel stocks that are closest to weapons grade, lengthening the breakout time Iran would need to make fissile material for a nuclear bomb. The West has not recognized Iran's self-proclaimed right to enrich uranium, and the deal paves the way for more negotiations to further curtail Iran's nuclear activity and its sponsorship of terrorism. And Iran vows not to operate its planned plutonium reactor for at least the next 6 months, and the agreement allows for nuclear inspections to go on all over Iran. So those are supposedly the good things. And the supposed bad things are that enrichment is capped but not frozen or rolled back, leaving Iran close to a breakout for a bomb. The deal also allows Iran to claim the West has accepted its right to enrich uranium, and the uranium enrichment capabilities are not dismantled, as had been demanded by UN resolutions. The deal eases sanctions that cannot be reversed easily, and Iran's plutonium reactor will not be operational for at least 1 year. So suspending operations for 6 months is relatively meaningless. And then the concerns about a nuclear arms race going on in the Middle East, which there's threats of that going on now. And but I'll get to that in a minute. So anyway, the so-called easing of sanctions is relative. Let's talk about that first. $7 billion in relief from sanctions. And it's estimated that Iran has lost $80 billion in oil revenue just since last year. And the economy contracted 6% last year. So this is these sanctions have been pretty devastating. They have inflation that's well over 25%. And $7 billion is a drop in the bucket. So let's not exaggerate how much the sanctions have been lifted. There's been various forms of sanctions, at least by the United States, since 1979. So let's bear that in mind as well. Some sanctions have been going on for some 30 years now. And so anyway, the other interesting things about these negotiations, of course, are that apparently there has been secret meetings with U.S. representatives for the last 6 months or so. And there's been some form of negotiations going on for the last 4 years. So this is a interesting revelation that this is going on. So the jury is still out on exactly what the real agenda is here and what is really going to happen. It's hard for me to believe that after all this time that negotiations are now open with Iran and that relationship between the United States and Iran will thaw out, because this also necessarily makes a huge transition in the United States relationship to Israel and Saudi Arabia. And that's the other part of the story that is so interesting, is hearing the rhetoric and the moves by all the other nations that are interested in the United States relationship with Iran. So we have Saudi Arabia making some very dramatic moves, refusing a spot on the Security Council and talking about perhaps acquiring a nuclear bomb from Pakistan. All these stories are making the news. And a lot of this is just to play into the propaganda war that's going on right now in Jordan, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, are all countries that are concerned about this shift in direction, and none more so than Israel, of course. And Netanyahu's isolating himself more and more and more. And we have the radical Zionist right out in force, including Abel Adelson, William Crystal, and various other hard right-wing bloggers, all talking about the idea that Israel should just go ahead and nuke Iran. And Netanyahu certainly seems to believe in this sort of tact. He's out talking about the most dangerous country in the world with the most dangerous reputation, getting a hold of the most dangerous weapons. And one could easily suggest that was the country of Israel that he was talking about. I found it interesting that also Saudi Arabia rhetoric is pretty hypocritical as well. One chairman of Saudi Arabia's Shura Council came out and said that, quote, the government of Iran, month after month, has proven that it has an ugly agenda in the region, and in this regard, no one in the region will sleep and assume things are going smoothly, unquote. And he goes on to say, quote, I am afraid Iran will give up something to get something else from the big powers in terms of regional politics, and I'm worrying about giving Iran more space or a freer hand in the region, unquote. And this is all about Saudi Arabia's desire to be that major player in the region. So they're only talking about a rivalry. It's interesting to see Saudi Arabia referring to the ugly agenda of Iran when Saudi Arabia's ugly agenda in Syria is evident to the world. So anyway, we have Netanyahu out. He's been giving speeches for the last several months, including some dramatic speeches to the UN, and he has brought out the most inflammatory of rhetoric. He evokes Jewish mythology and the right of Israel justified by this history. He refers to the Iranian takeover in 1979 as crushing hope for democracy, unquote, which is a ridiculous statement considering the Shah was a brutal despot that ruled Iran before the Khomeini took over and the Islamic Republic was born. So to say that any hope of democracy was crushed then is misleading at best. He's also talked about how Iran has an unforgiving creed and an unforgiving regime, unquote, which is also rather interesting considering Netanyahu appears to be the most unforgiving person and the most unforgiving regime in the region. And Netanyahu's gone on to criticize Iran's democracies. He's criticized Iran's support of Assad. He's criticized Iranian agents assassinating figures around the world, which is interesting hypocrisy once again, as Israel is noted for assassinating its opponents around the world. And he talks about the global ambitions of this fanatical regime, unquote, which there has been no evidence to that. Iran has a long history of being a peaceful regime, and the criticisms of them now seem to be distortions of realities. For example, certainly Iran is working with proxy forces around the region to serve its interests in the region, just like all the other players that criticize it, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States. So that's a hypocrisy. And then the fact that Netanyahu keeps bringing up statements by Ahmadinejad. And Ahmadinejad, though he was the spokesman for Iran, he didn't necessarily represent the views of the entire country. And the distorted statement that Iran wishes to wipe Israel off the map, when the actual reading was they wanted the Zionist regime relegated to the pages of history. There's quite a difference there. And these distortions continue to live on and continue to be milked for all their worth. And the Israeli rhetoric continues as Netanyahu calls this not a historic event in diplomacy, but a historic mistake. And so we see a huge split between the policies of the hardline Zionists, the Saudi Arabians, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, Egypt, all the Sunni nations, and Israel, all lining up on one side. And that includes all the Zionists and all the neocon warmongers in the United States who are calling for more sanctions in the midst of this negotiation. But let's get realistic. The general goal, the real agenda, will be to preserve Iran. My theory all along has been that Iran potentially could be a target, but more than likely not, as most transnational companies and the powers that be, and certainly energy and oil companies, all want Iran to remain intact so we can have access to their resources. Fourth largest oil reserves in the world and the largest gas reserves in the world. And at the same time these negotiations are going on to alleviate this crisis, oil companies are already being invited back in and are being negotiating with the Iranian government to open up the oil industry. And Iran is even offering better terms than Iraq. Interesting in itself. So once again, this is about oil. This is about the petrodollar. Let's look at who wins by these negotiations. China, which has access to Iranian energy now. Europe, which will have access to a source of non-Russian oil down the pike. The United States, which will continue to maintain the petrodollar relationship with Iran, which is a very crucial point here. And then Russia, which has close ties with Iran and will now have access to advanced energy technology if transnational companies go into Iran and help develop resources there. Russia will benefit by that. So all the Western powers truly benefit by this, not the least of which is winding down this path to war. So there's the winners and the losers, Israel and Saudi Arabia. So let's watch this. This is very interesting. Are we really seeing an example of a U.S. president breaking away from control of its foreign policy by the likes of Israel and Saudi Arabia? And Israel and Saudi Arabia have made it very clear they are not happy with the situation. And Israel and Saudi Arabia have struck out on their own, making some pacts and arrangements and talk of a potential strike on Iran by themselves. Once again, I do not see this happening, although I don't want to rule it out. Certainly the Israelis have made it clear. One spokesman even said that we could stop Iran's nuclear program for a very, very, very long time to come, unquote. And so this still has the potential to play out a number of ways. And only then, as we see the next 6 months unfold, will we see what the real agenda is. But right now, it looks like there's an interesting shift going on between Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States and our relations. And we shall see how this plays out. So, I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.